In the summer of 1974, a community was shattered when young Sarah vanished without a trace from Camp Pinewood, leaving behind only whispers and speculation. For 4 decades, her disappearance remained a haunting mystery that consumed lives, destroyed families, and buried secrets beneath layers of time and silence. Now, after 40 years of unanswered questions, the truth has finally emerged from the shadows. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. In the sticky heat of June 1974, 12-year-old Mary Johnson vanished without a trace from Lake Pinecrest Camp. The picturesque summer retreat, nestled among towering pines in northern Vermont, became the epicenter of a mystery that would haunt Grantham Hollow for decades. Despite exhaustive searches by local authorities and volunteers, the only evidence of Mary's existence remained her silver charm bracelet, a birthday gift from her parents, found snagged on a splintered section of the wooden dock, and a trail of wet footprints that meandered across the shoreline before disappearing into nothingness. The investigation yielded nothing conclusive, no body, no witnesses, no closure. Just whispers and theories that eventually faded into uncomfortable silence as the small town collectively buried its unease beneath layers of forced normalcy. Now, 40 years later, Jennifer Smith stood at the entrance to Lake Pinecrest, her fingers clutching the reunion invitation she'd nearly thrown away a dozen times. At 52, the retired librarian had built a quiet life surrounded by books rather than people, finding solace in stories with definitive endings, unlike her own. Her auburn hair now carried streaks of silver, and fine lines had formed around her eyes, marking decades of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. "You don't have to do this," she whispered to herself, the familiar weight of guilt settling in her chest. Jennifer had been the last person to see Mary that night. They had argued, a childish spat over a boy named Michael Miller, and Jennifer had stormed off, leaving her best friend alone by the water. By morning, Mary was gone. The camp looked eerily unchanged, the same weathered sign, the same gravel path winding through dense forest, the same glittering lake that had swallowed secrets for generations. Jennifer inhaled deeply, the scent of pine and lake water unlocking memories she'd tried desperately to forget. Somewhere in the distance, she heard laughter, adult voices tinged with forced cheerfulness, masking the collective unease that had brought them all back. Clutching her overnight bag, Jennifer took her first step onto the grounds. The crunch of gravel beneath her shoes sounded impossibly loud in her ears. She was returning to face not just her former campmates, but the ghosts of their shared past. Whatever answers lay buried at Lake Pinecrest, Jennifer was finally ready to unearth them, even if they destroyed what remained of her carefully constructed life. Jennifer Smith stepped out of her car, her breath catching as Lake Pinecrest Camp materialized before her like a ghost from her past. The weathered wooden sign, the towering pines, the glimmer of water through the trees. It was as if time had stood perfectly still since that fateful summer of 1974. The scent hit her first, pine needles warmed by the sun, the mineral tang of lake water, and something indefinably nostalgic that transported her instantly back to her 12-year-old self. She had spent decades carefully compartmentalizing these memories, yet they flooded back with alarming clarity. "Jenny, you made it!" A woman with silver-streaked hair waved enthusiastically from the registration table. It took Jennifer a moment to recognize Patricia, once her cabin mate, now a grandmother with laugh lines etched around her eyes. All around, former campers greeted each other with hugs that lasted a beat too long, laughter that rang slightly too loud. Jennifer noticed how conversations paused when she approached, smiles freezing momentarily before widening with forced warmth. They all remembered whose best friend had vanished, whose life had been forever marked by that summer. "It's good to see you," Michael Miller said quietly, appearing at her elbow. The history teacher's eyes, held the same warmth she remembered, though now surrounded by fine lines. He squeezed her arm briefly before being called away, leaving Jennifer with the lingering sensation of his touch. Near the main lodge, Judith Davis had set up a welcome circle. The former counselor had transformed her natural empathy into a successful therapy practice, specializing in trauma recovery. Now, in her 60s, Judith maintained the same nurturing presence, though her stylish glasses couldn't hide the shadows beneath her eyes. "We'll be holding daily support sessions," Judith announced to the group, her professional voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "This reunion may bring up difficult emotions for many of us. The past doesn't always stay buried, especially here." Her gaze flickered briefly to Jennifer, then away. "These circles are optional, of course, but I encourage everyone to participate. Healing happens in community." Jennifer noticed how Judith's fingers nervously adjusted her necklace as she spoke, how her eyes darted toward the lake. Then back to the gathered former campers. The therapist was afraid, not just of memories, but of something more tangible. Harold Brown, forever known as Howie, approached with refreshments. The caretaker's weathered face broke into a genuine smile at the sight of Jennifer. "Didn't think you'd ever come back," he said softly, handing her a cup. "Brave of you." Jennifer accepted the drink, wondering if bravery and foolishness weren't sometimes the same thing. All around her, beneath the veneer of reunion joy, she sensed an unmistakable current of unease, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see if 40 years of silence would finally crack open. Harold Brown emerged from the maintenance shed, wiping grease-stained hands on his faded denim overalls. His weathered face broke into a familiar crooked grin when he spotted Jennifer across the campground. "Jenny Smith!" he bellowed, arms outstretched. 40 years, and you haven't changed a bit." Before she could protest, Harold, known to everyone as Howie since they were 12, enveloped her in a bear hug that smelled of pine sap and motor oil. Jennifer returned the embrace, surprised by the comfort she found in his solid presence. "Still keeping this place from falling apart?" she asked, noticing the heavy tool belt slung around his waist. The caretaker's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Someone has to. Never could leave Grantham Hollow, not after everything." Something flickered across his expression, a shadow Jennifer recognized all too well. Howie carried secrets as weighty as the wrench hanging from his belt. "You're the only one who stayed," Jennifer observed, studying the man who had once been the camp's notorious prankster, now its faithful guardian. He shrugged. "The place gets in your blood. Besides, someone needs to remember what happened here." Before Jennifer could press further, a commotion near the main lodge caught her attention. A group of former campers clustered around a newcomer, their excited voices carrying across the grounds. Her heart stuttered when she recognized him. Michael Miller stood tall among the group, his dark hair now threaded with silver at the temples. The history teacher looked thinner than she remembered, with lines etched around his eyes that hadn't been there at their 20-year reunion. Jennifer froze, suddenly conscious of her wind-blown hair and travel-worn clothes. Michael glanced up, his conversation faltering as their eyes met across the distance. The world around them seemed to still. He excused himself and walked toward her, his left hand tucked casually in his pocket, but not before Jennifer noticed the faded wedding ring and the jagged scar that ran across his knuckles. A scar she didn't remember. "Jennifer," he said simply, stopping a few feet away. His voice was deeper than she recalled, roughened by the years between them. "Michael," she replied, feeling 16 again, tongue-tied and flushed. The air between them crackled with unspoken questions. "What happened to your marriage? How did you get that scar? Do you still think about that summer, about Mary?" "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said finally. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted. Howie cleared his throat. "I'll leave you two to catch up," he said, but the look he gave them both suggested he understood exactly what remained unresolved between them. Both the old feelings and the old questions that had simmered beneath the surface for 4 decades. Jennifer tossed and turned on the narrow camp bed, its familiar creak a haunting reminder of summers past. Sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Mary Johnson's laughter, that distinctive giggle that used to echo through cabin 6 after lights out. The memory was so vivid, it felt like Mary might still be there, whispering secrets across the darkness. The digital clock on her smartphone read 2:15 in the morning. With a sigh, Jennifer Smith slipped her feet into worn sneakers and quietly made her way outside. The night air carried the scent of pine and lake water, unchanged after 40 years. Stars punctured the Vermont sky, brilliant without city lights to dim them. She found herself drawn to cabin 6 like a moth to flame. Harold had renovated most of the structures over the years, but this one remained largely untouched, a time capsule of that fateful summer. The retired librarian ran her fingers along the weathered wood, remembering how she and Mary had carved their initials beneath the windowsill. As Jennifer stepped onto the small porch, her floorboard shifted beneath her weight. She froze, listening for any sign she'd disturbed the other reunioners. When silence prevailed, she knelt down, curiosity piqued by the loose board. It moved easily under her touch, revealing a small cavity beneath. "What on earth?" she whispered, heart racing as her fingers brushed against something solid. Using her smartphone's flashlight, Jennifer discovered a water-stained wooden box wedged between the support beams. It looked deliberately hidden. With trembling hands, she pulled it free. The box was sealed with what appeared to be waterproof tape, now brittle with age. Jennifer pried it open carefully, her breath catching as the contents came into view. Inside lay a stack of damp drawings, childish illustrations of the lake, the woods, and stick figures labeled with familiar names. Beneath these was a faded camp journal, its pages warped but intact. Jennifer recognized Mary's distinctive looping handwriting immediately. Her throat tightened as she flipped through entries dated June 1974. At the bottom of the box, partially stuck to the wooden bottom, was a torn piece of paper, the ripped edge of what appeared to be a letter. The visible portion was addressed simply to J.S. Jennifer's own initials stared back at her, written in Mary's hand. The discovery sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the night air. Whatever Mary had hidden here had remained untouched for 4 decades. Jennifer clutched the box to her chest, suddenly aware that she held pieces of a puzzle she'd spent her entire adult life trying to solve. Jennifer's hands trembled as she pried open the water-stained wooden box, her heart racing. Inside lay Mary Johnson's camp journal, its pages warped and ink smudged from decades of dampness. The retired librarian carefully turned each fragile page, her breath catching as Mary's looping handwriting revealed growing fears about someone watching them. June 18th, 1974. I saw him again today, standing between the trees when we were swimming. Nobody believes me, but I know he's there. The journal detailed strange rules enforced only on the girls in cabin 6, earlier curfews, restricted swimming times, mandatory buddy systems even for bathroom trips. Mary had meticulously documented each new restriction, questioning why their cabin faced such scrutiny. June 22nd. Judith seems worried too. She checks our windows twice at night now. She won't say why, but her eyes look scared. Jennifer paused at a particularly troubling entry. The watcher was outside again. I told Jenny, but she thinks I'm making it up for attention. I'm not. I wish she believed me. The words stung. Had she really dismissed her best friend's fears? Jennifer couldn't remember, but guilt washed over her nonetheless. At the bottom of the box lay a torn fragment of a letter addressed simply to J.S., her initials. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. "Jenny, I need to tell you something important. I found out why they're watching us. It's worse than we thought. The cameras aren't just for—" The rest was missing, torn away or perhaps never completed. Jennifer searched the box again, hoping for the missing piece, but found nothing. What cameras? What had Mary discovered that frightened her so badly? She stayed up half the night, rereading the journal until her eyes burned, searching for clues she might have missed. When exhaustion finally claimed her, Jennifer dreamed of Mary standing on the dock, pointing toward the dark woods. Morning arrived with harsh sunlight streaming through cabin windows. Jennifer rose, her neck stiff from falling asleep, hunched over the journal. As she reached for her bag to put the precious items away, something fell out, a postcard she hadn't packed. The image showed Lake Pinecrest in summer, circa 1970s. Jennifer flipped it over, finding no stamp or address, just 5 words written in block letters. You looked away that night. Her blood ran cold. Someone at the reunion knew she had found the box. Someone was watching her now, just as they had watched Mary 40 years ago. Jennifer glanced toward the window, suddenly feeling exposed. Outside, Harold Brown walked past, carrying tools toward the dock, while Michael Miller stood near the mess hall, staring at her cabin with an unreadable expression. The wooden chairs creaked as former campers settled into a circle inside the main lodge. Judith Davis stood at the center, her therapist's smile not quite reaching her eyes. Jennifer Smith watched as the others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding direct eye contact with one another. Today, I want us to explore specific rules we remember from that summer, Judith began, her voice steady despite the tension, particularly those that might have seemed unusual at the time. A heavy silence followed, until Michael Miller cleared his throat. The girls in cabin 6 had that strict curfew, didn't they? No one else had to be in by 8. Several women nodded, memories crystallizing. Jennifer felt her pulse quicken. We couldn't go to the north side of the lake without a counselor, added Laura Walker, her fingers nervously twisting a tissue. But the boys could. And remember those buddy checks, Harold Brown interjected. The caretaker leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together. Every hour for cabin 6 girls, no one else. Jennifer watched Judith's professional composure falter momentarily. We were told it was for safety, the therapist said quietly. And safety from what? Jennifer asked, her voice cutting through the room. No one answered, the silence stretched, heavy with unspoken knowledge. Or who? She pressed. Judith abruptly ended the session, claiming they'd made good progress. As the group dispersed, Jennifer caught Michael watching her, his historian's eyes troubled by patterns emerging from the past. That afternoon, dark clouds rolled across the Vermont sky. The first crack of thunder sent campers scurrying to their cabins. Jennifer stood on the porch of the main lodge, watching fat raindrops pelt the surface of Lake Pinecrest. When the lights flickered and died, she seized her opportunity. Grabbing a flashlight from the emergency kit, Jennifer slipped down the hallway toward the archive room. No one had mentioned it during the tour, which only heightened her suspicion. The door was unlocked. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls, their metal surfaces cool against her fingertips. Jennifer trained her light on labels, maintenance, finances, camper records. In the back corner, she found what she sought, Summer Session 1974. The musty folder contained daily logs, staff schedules, and incident reports. Jennifer's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. July 12th through 16th. Missing entirely. The counselor assignment sheet had been altered, names scratched out and rewritten. Most disturbing was the incident log. Where entries should have documented Mary Johnson's disappearance, Jennifer found only torn paper edges and rewritten accounts that mentioned a homesick camper who returned to her parents. A lie, a deliberate falsification. The flashlight beam caught something else. A small notation in the margin of a staff evaluation. Witnessed by the watcher. Action taken. Jennifer froze, Mary's journal entry echoing in her mind. The watcher wasn't just her friend's imagination. Thunder crashed directly overhead as Jennifer realized the truth had been here all along, hidden in plain sight. Michael Miller caught Jennifer by the elbow as she hunched over the yellowed camp logs. Rain pounded against the archive room's windows, casting shifting shadows across the dusty space. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the storm. Jennifer jumped, nearly dropping her flashlight. "I could ask you the same thing." The history teacher's face was half hidden in darkness, but she could see the tension in his jaw. He ran a hand through his graying hair, the scar on his knuckles visible in the beam of light. "I've been wanting to tell you something for 40 years, Michael confessed, his words tumbling out in a rush. "That night, the night Mary disappeared, I saw her." Jennifer's breath caught. "What?" "She was by the canoe shed. It was after curfew, and I'd snuck out to smoke." His eyes darted away. "She wasn't alone, Jen. She was arguing with someone, a figure in the shadows. I couldn't see who it was." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Jennifer whispered, her heart hammering. "I tried. I told the camp director, but he—" Michael's voice cracked. "He said I was making things up to get attention. Threatened to send me home if I spread rumors." Outside, the storm intensified. Wind howling through the pines like a warning. The old building creaked under the assault. "We should get back," Jennifer said, tucking the logs into her bag. They made their way across the muddy grounds toward the main lodge. Near the lake, they spotted Howie Brown battling the elements, trying to secure loose equipment as waves crashed against the dock. "Need help!" Michael called out. The caretaker waved them over frantically. "The storm's breaking up the old section." The three of them fought against the rain and wind as wooden planks splintered and broke free. Jennifer grabbed a rope, helping to stabilize what remained of the structure. "Wait!" Howie shouted suddenly. "There's something under there!" The storm had dislodged part of the dock's foundation, revealing what appeared to be a small metal container wedged between the supports. Howie reached down, muscles straining as he pulled free a rusted chest no bigger than a shoebox. With trembling hands, he pried open the corroded latch. Inside, nestled in decades of silt and decay, lay a child's locket. Jennifer recognized it immediately. The delicate, heart-shaped pendant Mary Johnson had received for her 12th birthday, just weeks before she vanished. Howie turned it over, revealing the engraved initials, M.J. "It's been here all this time," Jennifer whispered, her voice nearly lost in the storm. Right beneath our feet, the three former campers exchanged looks of dawning horror as lightning illuminated the dark waters of Lake Pinecrest. Jennifer hunched over Mary's journal in the dim light of her cabin, her fingers tracing the faded ink of her friend's handwriting. The pages were water-damaged, but Mary Johnson's fear was unmistakable in every trembling line about the Watcher, a presence that seemed to follow her through the camp. "He's always there," Mary had written, "just beyond the trees, watching us, watching me." The retired librarian shivered despite the summer heat. She'd questioned several former campers about the term, but no one recalled using it. Yet the way Mary described this presence, patient, calculating, always just out of sight, filled Jennifer with cold certainty. This wasn't a child's imagination. It was something real. She closed the journal when a knock interrupted her thoughts. Opening the cabin door, she found a woman standing there, pale, thin, with anxious eyes that darted past Jennifer to scan the room. "Laura Walker," the woman introduced herself. "I was in cabin 4 that summer." Jennifer invited her inside, noting how Laura's hands trembled as she declined a seat, preferring to stand near the door as if ready to flee. "I saw your name on the reunion list," Laura explained. "I couldn't stay away once I knew you were here." "You were her friend." "Mary's friend," Jennifer confirmed softly. Laura nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "I left early that summer. My parents told everyone I had mono, but that wasn't true." Jennifer waited, sensing the weight of confession in the air between them. "3 nights before I left, I woke up around midnight," Laura continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Someone was outside our cabin, moving between the windows. I saw a shadow pause at each one, looking in." "Did you tell anyone?" Jennifer asked. I told Judith the next morning. She said it was probably Howie playing pranks. But Laura shook her head. It wasn't him. The figure was too tall, too still. And when I mentioned it to the camp director, he got angry, told me I was frightening the younger girls with stories. Jennifer's mind raced. The camp director's reaction seemed excessive for a simple misunderstanding. 2 nights later, I saw the same figure outside cabin 6, Mary's cabin. This time, the shadow had something in its hand, something that glinted in the moonlight. Laura's eyes filled with tears. The next day, my parents came to get me. I never saw Mary again. Jennifer felt a chill run through her. Did you ever see the person's face? No, Laura whispered, but whoever it was had access to the camp after hours, and the staff knew, or at least some of them did. They were protecting someone, Jennifer. I've been certain of that for 40 years. Jennifer drove her rental car along the familiar winding roads of Grantham Hollow to the assisted living facility where her mother now resided. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as she entered the building, her heart heavy with questions that had haunted her for decades. Ruth Smith sat in a floral armchair by the window, her once sharp eyes now clouded with confusion. At 78, dementia had stolen much of her memory, leaving only fragments of the woman Jennifer had known. "Mom," Jennifer said softly, taking her mother's hand. "It's me, Jenny." Ruth's gaze cleared momentarily, recognition flickering across her weathered face. "My little girl," she whispered, squeezing Jennifer's fingers. "You've come back to Grantham." They talked about simple things, the weather, the flowers outside the window, until Jennifer carefully steered the conversation toward the past. "Do you remember Mary Johnson, Mom? My friend from camp?" A shadow passed over Ruth's face. Her voice suddenly became clear, almost young again. "Mary," she whispered, "the one we failed." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. "We should have spoken up. Your father said it would ruin everything." Jennifer leaned forward. "What do you mean, Mom? What did Dad know?" But the moment of clarity had passed. Ruth's eyes glazed over, her mind retreating back into the fog. "Is it time for bingo?" she asked pleasantly, as if the previous conversation had never happened. Later that evening, Jennifer met Howie at the main lodge. The caretaker had brought out boxes of old photographs, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he sorted through the yellowed images. "I've kept everything," Harold Brown explained, spreading photos across the wooden table. "Thought someday someone might want to remember." Jennifer sifted through group shots of smiling children, camp activities, and counselor gatherings. Her fingers froze on a particular photograph from 1974. The familiar faces of campers and staff smiled back at her, except for one woman standing slightly apart from the group. "Who's this?" Jennifer asked, pointing to the unsmiling counselor with dark hair. Howie frowned, squinting at the image. "Don't recall her name. Strange thing is, there's no writing on the back for her, see?" He flipped the photo over, revealing names meticulously recorded beside each face, except for the mystery woman. "I don't remember her at all," Jennifer murmured. "Neither do I," Howie admitted. "And I've been here forever. It's like she just appeared that summer and then vanished." Jennifer felt a chill run through her. "Just like Mary," she whispered, tucking the photograph into her pocket. Jennifer wiped sweat from her brow as she ventured behind the mess hall, drawn by an inexplicable feeling that had been gnawing at her since she'd found Mary's journal. The afternoon sun filtered through the Vermont pines, casting dappled shadows across the ground as she pushed aside a tangle of overgrown bushes. That's when she saw it, a narrow path, barely visible beneath years of neglect. Jennifer pulled out the camp map she'd found in the archives, studying it carefully. This trail appeared on none of the official documents. Her heart quickened as she stepped onto the forgotten path, branches catching at her sleeves. "What were you hiding, Mary?" she whispered, ducking under a low-hanging branch. The trail twisted through increasingly dense underbrush, the camp sounds fading behind her. After nearly 15 minutes of careful navigation, the path opened to a small clearing where nature had reclaimed what humans had abandoned. Before her stood the crumbling remains of a stone foundation, moss-covered and half-buried in decades of fallen leaves. Jennifer approached slowly, kneeling to run her fingers along the weathered stones. This wasn't just any structure. It was too small for staff quarters, but too far from the main camp for regular activities. "A hiding place," she murmured, carefully stepping over the fallen stones. Inside the foundation, nothing remained except dirt, leaves, and the unmistakable sense of secrets long buried. As the librarian turned to leave, the fading light caught something protruding from the undergrowth. Jennifer carefully pulled away the tangle of weeds, revealing an old canoe paddle, its wood grey with age but remarkably preserved. She turned it over in her hands, her breath catching when she saw what was carved into the worn handle, M+J, inside a rough heart. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. M for Mary, J for Jennifer. A memento of a plan Jennifer had never known about. "You were going to run away," she whispered, clutching the paddle to her chest. "And you wanted me to come with you." Memories flooded back, Mary's whispered fears about the Watcher, her growing anxiety that summer, the way she'd asked Jennifer if she'd ever thought about leaving Grantham Hollow behind. At 12 years old, Jennifer had dismissed it as fantasy talk. Now, holding the evidence in her trembling hands, she understood the gravity of what Mary had been planning. Harold Brown's words from earlier that day suddenly took on new meaning. "Some secrets stay buried because we're too scared to dig," he'd said, his weathered face solemn beneath his cap. Jennifer tucked the paddle under her arm and began the trek back to camp, her mind racing. If Mary had planned an escape, who or what had she been running from? And had someone discovered her plan before she could execute it? The Grantham Hollow Library smelled of dust and forgotten things. Jennifer Smith hunched over the microfiche reader, scrolling through the Grantham Gazette archives from the summer of '74. Her eyes burned from strain, but she couldn't stop now. "Can I help you find anything specific?" The young librarian's voice startled her. "No, thank you. Just researching local history," Jennifer replied, not wanting to explain her true purpose. As the retired librarian scrolled through June 1974, a small headline caught her eye. "County Health Inspector conducts surprise visit to local camps." The article mentioned a Theodore Winters who had inspected Lake Pinecrest and 2 other summer camps that month. What struck Jennifer as odd was the final line. Inspector Winters concluded his visit with no further comment. Jennifer checked subsequent issues. No follow-up reports. No mention of findings. Nothing. She jotted down the name and date in her notebook, then searched county employment records. Theodore Winters appeared nowhere in official documentation after June 23, 1974, 5 days before Mary vanished. Back at camp, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds. Jennifer found Judith sitting alone on a bench overlooking the lake, her therapist's composure momentarily absent. "I've been wanting to talk to you," the former counselor said, her voice barely audible above the lapping water. "There's something I never told anyone." Jennifer sat beside her, heart quickening. "In 1980, 6 years after everything happened, I received a note." Judith's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. It was handwritten, postmarked from Seattle. It said, "Mary is alive. She remembers everything." "What did you do?" Jennifer asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Nothing." Shame colored Judith's face. "I convinced myself it was some cruel joke. We'd all moved on, or tried to. The camp had recovered its reputation. I was building my practice as a therapist." She looked directly at Jennifer. "I burned the note and never told anyone. Not the police, not her parents, no one." Jennifer fought back anger. "You didn't think it might be real." "I was afraid it might be," Judith admitted. "And I was more afraid of what would happen if we started digging again, what we might find." She wiped a tear. "I've carried that decision for 34 years now. Jennifer stared at the water, imagining Mary crossing it that night, perhaps fleeing from something or someone. The pieces were starting to align: a missing health inspector, a camp desperate to protect its reputation, and a girl who might have seen too much. "I need to know who Theodore Winters was," Jennifer said finally, "and why his name disappeared from records the same summer Mary did." The evening sun cast long shadows across the lake as Jennifer walked along the weathered dock. Lost in thought, she barely noticed Harold Brown approaching until he was right beside her, his weathered face etched with worry. "Jen," Howie said, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands trembled as he guided her toward the end of the dock, away from the other reunion attendees. "I've been carrying something for 40 years. Jennifer felt her heart quicken as the caretaker glanced nervously over his shoulder. "What is it, Howie?" "I found it," he confessed, his voice breaking. 2 days after they called off the search for Mary, I was clearing debris from the storm drain near the boathouse." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small cloth bundle. "The camp director, he made me swear I'd never tell, said it would ruin Lake Pinecrest forever." As he unwrapped the cloth, Jennifer gasped. There, in his calloused palm, lay Mary Johnson's charm bracelet, tarnished by decades but unmistakable. The tiny silver ballet slipper, the miniature book, the half-heart that matched the one Jennifer herself had worn that summer. "I should have spoken up," Howie said, tears welling in his eyes. "But I was just 19, needed the job. By the time I found my courage, it seemed too late." Jennifer cradled the bracelet, each charm a memory of her lost friend. "You're speaking up now," she whispered. "That matters." Later that evening, tucked away in cabin 6 with her laptop, Jennifer followed a digital trail that had been nagging at her since seeing the old camp photos. A counselor whose face seemed vaguely familiar, Carol Wilson, had vanished from all records after 1980. With trembling fingers, Jennifer cross-referenced literary databases until the connection materialized on her screen. Carol Wilson had legally changed her name in 1985, reinventing herself as C.W. Blackwood, author of psychological thrillers. Her best-selling novels featured young girls at summer camps, mysterious disappearances, and communities bound by terrible secrets. Jennifer scrolled through book summaries, her blood running cold. Blackwood's third novel, The Silent Pines, featured a 12-year-old protagonist who discovered hidden cameras in her camp's birdhouses. Her latest work, 40 Summers Gone, told of a woman returning to the site of her childhood trauma. These weren't just stories, they were confessions thinly veiled as fiction. Jennifer closed her laptop, mind racing. Carol hadn't just witnessed what happened that summer, she'd been documenting it for decades, hiding the truth in plain sight while building a literary empire on Mary's tragedy. Jennifer's hands trembled as she connected the final pieces of the puzzle. The mysterious watcher that had haunted Mary Johnson's journal wasn't a person stalking the campgrounds, it was something far more insidious. "They were everywhere," she whispered, spreading the faded camp blueprints across the table. Small X marks dotted the perimeter of cabin 6, the dock, and the changing areas. Cameras, disguised as birdhouses and hollow tree trunks. The camp founder, Edward Pinecrest, had installed the surveillance system in 1973, claiming it was for camper safety. Jennifer's stomach turned as she realized the truth. The cameras had been strategically placed to monitor the children, particularly the girls. Harold Brown approached her that evening, his weathered face grave in the dim light of the main lodge. "I need to tell you something else," he said, his voice barely audible over the distant sounds of the reunion gathering. "You knew about the cameras," Jennifer said. It wasn't a question. The caretaker nodded, shame evident in his downcast eyes. "Not at first. I found one while fixing a loose board on the dock. Thought it was some kind of weird bird feeder, until I saw the lens." He explained how the camp director had sworn him to secrecy, insisting the devices were necessary after several incidents of camper misbehavior. Howie had been young, afraid of losing his job, and reluctant to question authority. Mary found one, he continued, his voice breaking. That last week, she was sketching birds near the lake when she noticed something odd about one of the birdhouses. She pried it open and found the camera inside. Jennifer felt a chill run through her body. She was going to tell someone. She told me she was going to contact her parents, Howie confirmed. Said it wasn't right, that we were being watched. The next day, his voice trailed off. She disappeared, Jennifer finished. The librarian closed her eyes, remembering Mary's final journal entry. I found out what the Watcher really is. I'm telling tomorrow. Jay will back me up. Jennifer had always assumed her friend meant she would back Mary up, but Mary had vanished before ever asking for her help. Judith Davis entered the room, her therapist's composure momentarily shattered when she saw the blueprints. You found them, she said quietly. Did you know? Jennifer demanded. Not then, Judith replied. Years later, when I was studying psychology, I came back to volunteer one summer. I found a camera while cleaning out the old storage shed. By then, the system had been abandoned, but the equipment was still there. Jennifer felt sick. The entire camp, their childhood sanctuary, had been corrupted by voyeuristic surveillance, and an entire town had kept silent for decades. Mary discovered the truth, she said softly. And then she vanished. Jennifer's legs nearly gave out beneath her as she stared at the yellowed financial records spread across the table in the archive room. Her father's signature, Frank Smith, appeared on donation checks, investment documents, and most disturbingly, confidentiality agreements dated just before the camp's expansion in 1973. He had access to everything, Michael whispered beside her, his weathered history teacher's hands steadying her elbow. Did the security logs, the incident reports, all of it. She pulled away, bile rising in her throat. All these years searching for the truth, never imagining it would lead back to her own family. Frank Smith, the quiet accountant who'd never quite looked her in the eye when she mentioned Mary's name. The man who'd insisted they never speak of that summer again. Did he know? She asked the empty air. Did my father know what happened to Mary? Michael offered no answer, just the comforting pressure of his hand on her shoulder. That evening, Judith Davis gathered the former campers in the main lodge one last time. The therapist's professional demeanor had cracked, revealing the frightened counselor who'd once watched over them. Rain lashed against the windows as thunder rolled across the lake. I think it's time we stopped dancing around what we all remember, Judith said, her voice barely audible above the storm. The rules that summer weren't normal. Laura Walker nodded vigorously. We couldn't go to the bathroom alone after dark, or walk near the tree line, another woman added. The buddy system was enforced with unusual strictness, Michael said, his scar-marked hand clenching into a fist. Howie Brown, sitting apart from the circle, spoke up. The director told us it was for safety after that hiker went missing in May, but it felt like we were being watched, Jennifer finished. A current of recognition passed through the group, heads nodding, eyes widening with shared memory. I found Mary's journal, Jennifer continued, her voice strengthening. She called it the Watcher. Not a person, a system. My father helped pay for it. Judith's face drained of color. The birdhouses, the new trail markers. They weren't just decorative. Were they? They were cameras, Jennifer confirmed, and Mary found out. The room fell silent, save for the drumming rain. Decades of individual fears suddenly coalesced into a single, terrible understanding. Something had been deeply wrong at Lake Pinecrest that summer, something an entire town had conspired to forget. We all sensed it, Judith whispered. We all knew something wasn't right, and we said nothing. Jennifer looked around at the circle of aging faces, each marked by the same guilt she'd carried for 40 years. Well, she said quietly, we're saying something now. Jennifer was sitting in her motel room, staring at her laptop screen, when the email arrived. No subject line, No signature, just a single line of text that made her blood run cold. "You're close. The truth is waiting at the old staff cabin." Her fingers trembled as she closed the device. Who knew she was here? Who was watching her progress? The message could only be from someone intimately familiar with what she'd discovered so far. The next morning, Jennifer Smith returned to Lake Pinecrest, the weight of 40 years pressing down on her shoulders. She bypassed the main camp area and headed straight for the overgrown trail she'd found days earlier. The path seemed narrower now, more forbidding, as if the forest itself was reluctant to give up its secrets. The mossy stone foundation appeared through the trees, bathed in dappled sunlight. Jennifer approached slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. This time, she noticed what she'd missed before, a partial roof still intact on one side, creating a sheltered corner that had somehow withstood decades of Vermont winters. "Mary," she whispered, though she knew no answer would come. Jennifer ducked inside the ruins, the smell of damp earth and rotting wood filling her nostrils. Scattered across the dirt floor were the remnants of someone's desperate existence: faded blankets, threadbare and mouldy, a broken lantern, its glass cracked but intact, and, her breath caught, a small canvas shoe, unmistakably a child's. The retired librarian sank to her knees, carefully lifting the tiny shoe. It was Mary's size, or would have been. The realization struck her with physical force. Someone had lived here, hidden away from the world. Jennifer ran her hands along the crumbling walls, searching for anything else. Near the back corner, her fingers caught on something different, a loose stone that shifted under pressure. Behind it lay a small cavity, and within, wrapped in plastic, a notebook. The journal's pages were filled with cramped, unsteady handwriting, the ink faded but legible. Jennifer opened to the first entry, dated August 1974, weeks after Mary's reported disappearance. "They're still looking, but not here. I can hear them sometimes. I'm safe as long as I stay hidden." Jennifer's vision blurred with tears. This wasn't just evidence, this was survival, documented in a child's shaking hand. Page after page chronicled fear, confusion, and a desperate attempt to make sense of betrayal. The final entry simply read, "Someone help me. I'm leaving tonight. If you find this, know I tried to be brave." Jennifer clutched the journal to her chest, overwhelmed by what it meant. Mary hadn't just vanished, she had escaped, had hidden, had survived, and somewhere out there, she might still be alive. Jennifer drove her car slowly down the winding gravel road that led to the outskirts of Grantham Hollow. The Thompson residence stood like a sentinel at the edge of town, a Victorian farmhouse with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that had witnessed nearly a century of the town's secrets. Mrs. Margaret Thompson, at 92, was the oldest living resident of Grantham Hollow. The elderly woman welcomed Jennifer with surprising strength in her handshake, her eyes clear and sharp beneath a crown of silver hair. "I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions for 40 years, Margaret said, pouring tea into delicate cups that trembled slightly in her weathered hands. "I knew it would be you, Jennifer Smith. You were always the one who cared the most." The living room was a museum of memories, photographs in tarnished frames, knitted blankets, and the lingering scent of lavender. Jennifer's heart raced as the elderly woman settled into her armchair and began to speak. "That summer, 1974, we had the terrible fire in the North Woods," Margaret began. "Everyone was focused on saving the camp buildings. Nobody was looking for a child who was already presumed lost." She described how, 3 days after the fire, she'd been gathering blackberries near the stream that bordered her property when she heard sobbing. There, huddled beneath a fallen log, was Mary Johnson, alive but nearly unrecognizable. Her clothes were torn, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wild with terror. "She wouldn't let me call anyone," Margaret continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Only she kept saying, 'They'll find me, and he's watching.' I couldn't bear to force her, not in that state." For 6 weeks, Margaret hid the girl in her root cellar, bringing her food and clean clothes, trying to coax out what had happened. Mary would only say that someone at camp had hurt her, that she'd discovered something terrible, and that no one would believe her, not even Jennifer. One morning, I went down with breakfast, and she was gone, Margaret said, tears welling in her eyes, just a note saying, "Thank you, and I have to keep running." I searched for days, but she'd vanished completely. Jennifer's hands shook as she placed her teacup down. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" The elderly woman's gaze hardened. "Who would I tell? The sheriff was in Frank Smith's pocket, your father's. The camp director threatened to have me committed when I tried to hint at what I knew. This town protects its own, Jennifer. Always has. And you've kept this secret all these years," Jennifer whispered. Margaret nodded slowly. "I promised Mary I would keep her safe. Sometimes safety means silence until the right moment comes." Jennifer sat alone on the dock, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. The water lapped gently against the wooden posts as 40 years of secrets crystallized in her mind. Mary Johnson hadn't simply vanished into thin air that summer night. The truth was far more complex and heartbreaking. First, Mrs. Margaret Thompson had hidden Mary away, protecting the terrified child from whatever had frightened her so deeply. Then, when the town's search parties grew too close, others had stepped in, people with reputations to protect, careers that would crumble if the truth emerged. They moved her. Jennifer whispered to herself, the realization like ice in her veins. They kept moving her. She thought of her own father, Frank, and his financial ties to the camp, the tampered logs, the missing pages, the carefully constructed narrative that a 12-year-old girl had simply wandered into the woods and disappeared. A twig snapped behind her. Jennifer turned to find Carol Wilson standing there, her best-selling author's confidence barely masking something deeper, determination, perhaps even desperation. "You've figured it out, haven't you?" Carol asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This reunion," Jennifer said, "you arranged it all, the invitations, the timing, everything." The author nodded, sitting beside Jennifer on the weathered planks. "I've been writing the same story for 20 years, Jennifer. Different characters, different settings, but always the same truth hiding underneath. No one ever noticed." "But why now?" Jennifer asked. "Because the statute of limitations has expired on some things, but not on others," Carol explained. "And because I'm dying. Cancer, 6 months, maybe less." The pieces shifted again in Jennifer's mind. "You were never trying to hide the truth. You've been trying to expose it." Carol smiled sadly. "I was a coward back then. We all were, even Judith, with all her therapy circles and healing talk. Even Howie, with his maintenance work, that conveniently kept him close to where it all happened." Jennifer thought of Michael's scar, of Judith's nervous eyes, of the strange way the town had closed ranks around the camp after Mary's disappearance. "They all know," Jennifer whispered. "The whole town knows something." "Not everything," Carol replied, "but enough to be complicit, enough to look away. I couldn't live with it anymore." The setting sun cast long shadows across the lake, the same waters that had swallowed Mary's footprints 40 years ago. Jennifer realized the reunion wasn't just about uncovering the past. It was Carol's final attempt at redemption, a reckoning she'd orchestrated to finally break the silence that had held them all captive for decades. The news about Mary Johnson's disappearance spread through Grantham Hollow like wildfire. What began as whispers among reunion attendees quickly erupted into a full-blown scandal that rocked the sleepy Vermont town to its core. Residents who had spent decades avoiding eye contact when the subject of Lake Pinecrest Camp arose now found themselves unable to escape the truth. Town officials, many of whom had been teenagers themselves when Mary vanished, convened an emergency meeting at the town hall. The mayor, visibly shaken, announced a formal inquiry into the camp's history. "No stone will remain unturned," she promised. though her trembling voice betrayed her fear of what might be discovered beneath those stones. Jennifer Smith watched from the back row as decades of carefully constructed lies began to crumble. She noticed how Judith Davis sat rigid in her chair, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. The therapist had finally unburdened herself of secrets kept far too long, though the relief seemed to weigh as heavily as the guilt had. Documents long buried in municipal archives were subpoenaed. Former staff members, some now elderly and frail, were called to testify. The investigation revealed a web of cover-ups spanning generations: camp directors who falsified reports, local police who abandoned searches prematurely, and town officials who redirected inquiries away from uncomfortable truths. Harold Brown provided crucial testimony about the security cameras disguised as birdhouses, confirming Mary's journal entries about the Watcher. The caretaker's weathered face showed both relief and regret as he finally spoke his truth after 40 years of silence. Lake Pinecrest Camp was permanently shuttered within weeks. Yellow caution tape stretched across the entrance, fluttering in the breeze like a final surrender. The property, once filled with children's laughter, fell into an eerie silence broken only by the arrival of documentary crews. Their vans lined the gravel road as filmmakers and journalists combed through the grounds, determined to uncover every shadowy corner of the camp's history. Michael Miller found Jennifer sitting alone on the dock one evening as a film crew packed up their equipment nearby. "I never thought I'd see the day," he said, lowering himself beside her. "This town was always so obsessed with appearances." "That's what made it the perfect hiding place," Jennifer replied. But nobody wanted to look beneath the surface. The painful process of confronting the past had only just begun for Grantham Hollow. Families were divided, friendships fractured, as residents were forced to examine their own complicity in maintaining the silence. The town would never be the same, but perhaps, Jennifer thought as she watched the sunset reflect on the water, that was exactly what needed to happen. Jennifer Smith's phone buzzed with a text from her brother. "You've gone too far. Dad's legacy is ruined." The message stung, but didn't surprise her. Ever since the investigation into Lake Pinecrest had revealed Frank Smith's involvement in the cover-up, her brother had grown increasingly hostile. This final message made it clear he was cutting ties completely. The retired librarian sat alone in her small apartment, surrounded by newspaper clippings about the scandal that had rocked Grantham Hollow. Her quiet life of alphabetizing books and tending to her garden had transformed into endless interviews with detectives, journalists, and documentary filmmakers. The solitude she'd carefully cultivated over decades had evaporated, replaced by uncomfortable scrutiny and whispered accusations at the grocery store. "Was it worth it?" Judith had asked during their last therapy session. Jennifer hadn't answered then. But now, driving along the winding Vermont roads toward their meeting place, she knew, despite everything she'd lost, her privacy, her relationship with her brother, her place in the community, the truth had been worth uncovering. The small cabin in the woods belonged to Harold. He'd offered it as neutral ground, somewhere away from prying eyes. Jennifer parked her vehicle and sat for a moment, gathering courage. Through the windshield, she could see a slight figure waiting on the porch, grey hair catching the afternoon light. Mary Johnson looked nothing like the vibrant 12-year-old who had disappeared that summer. Decades of isolation had left her frail, her movements hesitant, her eyes constantly scanning for threats. When Jennifer approached, Mary flinched before forcing a tremulous smile. "You found me," Mary whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. "I never stopped looking," Jennifer replied, tears welling in her eyes. They walked together beneath the towering pines, the same species that had given the camp its name. Words came slowly at first, then in torrents, 40 years of silence breaking like a dam. Mary described her years in hiding, moving from town to town, always looking over her shoulder. Jennifer confessed her decades of guilt, the nightmares that had plagued her since that summer. "I should have protected you," Jennifer said, her voice breaking. Mary took her hand, the gesture bridging years of separation. You were just a child too. As afternoon light filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows on their faces, they found something neither had expected: forgiveness. Not just for each other, but for themselves, two survivors of a tragedy that had defined their lives, finally beginning to heal. The golden light of late summer cast long shadows across Lake Pinecrest as Jennifer Smith and Mary Johnson stood together at the water's edge. 40 years had etched lines into their faces, but in this moment, with the gentle lapping of waves against the weathered dock, they were 12 again, before secrets had torn them apart. "I used to imagine you here," Jennifer whispered, her voice barely carrying over the rustling pines. "Every summer, I'd come back and sit right here, hoping somehow you'd appear." Mary's fingers tightened around Jennifer's, her touch fragile yet determined. The reclusive woman had spent decades hiding from the world, building walls that only crumbled when Jennifer had finally tracked her down at Mrs. Thompson's old cottage on the outskirts of Grantham Hollow. "I was so afraid," Mary said, watching a leaf spiral down to the water's surface. "Not just of them, but that no one would believe me." The retired librarian nodded, understanding the weight of those words. The investigation had exposed everything: the hidden cameras disguised as birdhouses, the cover-up orchestrated by the camp director, and the complicity of Jennifer's own father. Frank Smith's involvement had shattered her world, but the truth had set her free. Behind them, the abandoned camp stood silent. Yellow police tape still marked areas where forensic teams had excavated evidence. The documentary crews had finally packed up their equipment, leaving only memories and ghosts. "Judith called yesterday," Jennifer said. "She's starting a support group for the others." The therapist had found her own redemption in helping fellow survivors process their trauma. Mary smiled faintly. "And Howie? How is he handling all this?" "Better than expected." The caretaker testified against the board members, said it felt like putting down a burden he'd carried since '74. A heron took flight across the lake, its wings cutting through the amber light. Mary watched it soar, free and unburdened. "I never thought I'd stand here again," she admitted. "After Margaret took me in, I dreamed of this place every night. Not the fear, just you, just us, swimming and laughing." Jennifer wiped away a tear. "Michael asked about you. Said he kept that old paddle all these years." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and approaching autumn. These woods had held their secrets for decades, but secrets couldn't survive in the light. "What happens now?" Mary asked, her voice stronger than it had been in 40 years. Jennifer turned to face her childhood friend, the person she'd mourned and searched for across a lifetime. "Now we live," she said simply. "Not as victims or witnesses, but as the ones who finally broke the silence." Hand in trembling hand, they faced the lake together, no longer captives of the past, but survivors with their story finally heard.